Chapter 1. Hatshepsut, the pharaoh who became king. Long before the sun rose over her monuments, before the chisel etched her name into temple walls, Hatshepsut was simply a child beneath the stars of Thebes. Born around 1507 BCE in the Sai, golden cradle of Egypt's 18th dynasty, she came into the world wrapped in linen and legacy. Her father, Thutmose I, was pharaoh, a warrior king who extended Egypt's reach into Nubia. Her mother, Amosa, bore the title Great Royal Wife, a distinction that carried more than ceremonial weight. It meant that Hatshepsut was not merely a princess, she was heir to expectation. She grew up surrounded by incense and ink, papyrus scrolls and sacred rituals. Her days were filled with instruction in languages, mathematics, astronomy, and most importantly, the religion of the gods. She would have watched the priests in white linen robes perform rites before Amun, the hidden one, the god of air and the unseen. She would have learned that pharaohs were not only rulers but divine intermediaries. They were bridges between heaven and earth, and yet, being a girl, her future seemed scripted. Royal daughters married strategically. They bore sons. They supported kings. That was the rhythm, that was the mold. But Hatshepsut did not grow up to fit into molds. She studied how power moved through the court, how words were used in the temple, how symbols were carved into stone. And slowly, the young girl who traced her lineage to the gods began to understand something deeper, that blood alone was not destiny. Action was. By the time her father passed, Hatshepsut had already been named God's wife of Amun, one of the most powerful spiritual titles a woman could hold. It granted her wealth, influence, and a direct association with the divine. The seeds of something unprecedented were already taking root. Regent to ruler. When Thutmose I died, the throne passed to Thutmose II, Hatshepsut's half-brother and her husband, as royal custom dictated. His reign was short and quiet. He left behind a son, Thutmose III, by a lesser wife, a boy too young to rule. So the court turned to Hatshepsut to act as regent, a guardian queen, to hold the kingdom steady until the child could wear the crown. At first, she stepped into this role as expected, with dignity, reserve, and the robes of a caretaker. But something shifted. Perhaps it was the sluggish machinery of the court. Perhaps it was the whisper of ambition, or maybe, simply, she saw clearly that her vision for Egypt could not wait for a boy to grow into a man. In the 7th year of her regency, the transformation began. She shed the trappings of a guardian and claimed the full titles of kingship. No longer regent, pharaoh. She did not hide her gender, but she did wrap herself in the symbols of male power. She wore the shendi kilt, the ceremonial beard, the headdress of a king, but she remained Hatshepsut, woman, daughter of Amun, pharaoh. It was more than political theatre. It was a theological argument. She declared that Amun himself had fathered her, that her right to rule was written in the heavens. Reliefs were carved of the god visiting her mother in divine form. Her coronation was not just a coup of power. It was, in her own telling, the will of the gods. And so Egypt watched as something unprecedented unfolded. A woman who did not pretend to be a man, a ruler who did not wait to be chosen. she stepped fully into the divine rhythm of kingship, and the land responded. Stone and symbol pharaohs leave footprints not just in records, but in rock. And Hatshepsut understood this better than most. Her reign was not filled with wars or sweeping campaigns. It was filled with stone, with vision, with permanence. At Deir el-Bahari, nestled in the cliffs west of Thebes, she raised her masterpiece, the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. It rose in terraces and colonnades, carved gently into the rock face as though the earth itself bowed to her design. White limestone gleamed under the sun. Carvings danced with scenes of her divine birth, her coronation, her devotion to the gods. Inside the temple, reliefs told of an extraordinary expedition, a voyage to the land of Punt. No one knows exactly where Punt was. Perhaps along the Red Sea coast, perhaps deeper into Africa. But her ships returned with incense trees, ivory, gold, baboons, and exotic gifts fit for the gods. These were not just trophies, they were evidence, proof that the gods favoured her. That prosperity followed her hand. Obelisks were raised at Karnak, soaring fingers of granite etched with her name. They were taller than any others before her. One still stands, the other lies where time split it. But even broken, it speaks of her reach. To rule Egypt was to manage the balance of the cosmos, ma'at, order, justice, harmony. Hatshepsut did not expand the borders with spear or shield. She expanded them with temples, trade, and theology. She restored shrines, revived festivals, and strengthened the priesthood of Amun, not just for piety, but for political partnership. A pharaoh, after all, was only as eternal as the gods, who supported her. Through these acts of stone and symbol, she rewrote the image of what it meant to be king, not in opposition to tradition, but from within it. She did not tear down old structures. She simply walked into them, stood tall and filled them with new light, erased, remembered, resurrected, and then silence. After 22 years of rule, Hatshepsut vanished from the annals of power. She likely died of natural causes, no grand battle, no uprising, just the quiet end of a queen who had once moved nations. But what came next was not rest, it was erasure. In the later years of Thutmose III, the boy she had once guarded, now, fully pharaoh, a systematic campaign unfolded. Her images were chiselled from walls, her cartouches were carved out, statues smashed, obelisks buried, her name, her face, her reign scrubbed from memory. Why? Theories swirl like desert dust. Was it revenge, a political necessity to restore a patriarchal line, a nervous cleansing of precedent? No one knows for certain, but the result was clear. Egypt tried to forget her, and for centuries it worked. Her temple stood, but her name did not echo. The story of Egypt's first full female pharaoh was reduced to whispers in broken stone, until the sands shifted again. In the 19th century, archaeologists began piecing her legacy back together. Fragments of statues, inscriptions, too deep, too fully scrape away. Slowly, like a ghost walking backward through time, Hatshepsut returned. In 2007, a breakthrough came. A tooth, found in a box inscribed with her name, matched a previously unidentified mummy from the Valley of the Kings. After millennia, her body had been found. After millennia, she was seen again, not just in relief, but in reality. Today, her face gazes out from museum cases and digital reconstructions. Her story is told in classrooms, in books, in the quiet voice of stone that refuses to stay silent. What was buried is uncovered. What was erased is remembered. And so, as you drift into sleep beneath your own stars, remember the woman who once ruled beneath a different sky. A girl raised in the courts of gods. A queen who stepped into a throne built for men and made it hers. She did not break tradition. She bent it like papyrus, shaped it like clay, carved it into permanence. And when the world tried to forget her, the stones themselves whispered her name, Hatshepsut, Pharaoh, daughter of Amun, the woman who became king. Sleep well, dreamer. The Nile flows on, the temples still stand, and history, like memory, always finds its way home. Chapter 2. Nefertiti, the Queen of the Sun. Long before her name would echo through museum halls and the silence of forgotten tombs, Nefertiti stepped into history with a presence that would never fully leave. Her name, in the language of the Nile, meant "the beautiful one has come." It was not just a title, it was a prophecy. No one knows exactly where she came from. Some say she was born of noble Egyptian blood, the daughter of a powerful court official who would one day wear the crown himself. Others whisper that she came from foreign lands, a diplomatic gift in a time of shifting power, brought across desert sands to join Egypt's royal house. What we do know is that she arrived at the heart of empire with a grace that stirred even stone to attention. In the city of Thebes, among the temples of Amun and the columns of gold, she married Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, a young king with ideas that did not fit the old world. Together they would burn away the traditions of the past and walk into the sun of something entirely new. Nefertiti was not like other queens. She was not content to remain in the shadows of palace walls or behind veils of ceremony. From the very beginning she was a partner, visible, commanding, and divine. In inscriptions she stands beside her husband as an equal. In rituals she offers to the gods in her own name. In every way she was more than consort, she was power. And in the years to come her image would rise not just as a royal woman, but as something transcendent, a bridge between earth and heaven, shaped in limestone and light. The Aten Revolution. The kingdom she entered was one of gods and ceremony, temples and tradition. Egypt's pantheon stretched wide, from jackal-headed Anubis to falcon-eyed Horus, and above them all, Amun, hidden and mighty, lord of the air and king of the gods. But Nefertiti's world was about to change. Her husband, Amenhotep IV, began to speak of a new vision, not a god cloaked in mystery, but one radiant and present, the Aten, the sun disk itself, a circle of fire, life-giving and eternal, without form but full of light. It was not just a religious idea. It was a revolution. He changed his name to Akhenaten, servant of the Aten. And Nefertiti followed. Together they left Thebes behind and carved a new city out of desert stone, Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, known today as Amarna. A city built not for priests or tradition, but for a new theology where the sun reigned alone. In this bold new world, Nefertiti was not only queen, she was priestess, co-ruler, goddess. Her face appeared in altars. Her name was spoken in hymns. She stood in the sacred spaces beside Akhenaten, not as a supporter, but as a pillar of the faith. This new religion was unlike anything Egypt had seen. Gone were the crowded temples of many gods. In their place, open courtyards welcomed the sun. Gone were the animal-faced deities of old. In their place, the Aten, faceless, formless, pure light. But change comes with cost. The old priesthood, the ancient power structures, they were not pleased. Amun's temples were closed, names were scratched out. The court itself split like stone under pressure, and through it all Nefertiti stood firm, draped in fine linen and golden crowns, the embodiment of the sun's favour. Whether she believed in this new theology with her whole heart, or simply saw the opportunity to rise in a new order, no one knows. But what is certain is that she embraced it, and in doing so, changed the face of Egypt. Art as propaganda. In the city of Akhetaten, art flourished with a strange and striking voice. The rigid symmetry of old Egyptian style gave way to something softer, more human, more alive, and at the heart of it all stood Nefertiti, carved, painted, and immortalized in ways no queen before her had been. In reliefs, she is shown not just standing beside Akhenaten, but leading worship, striking enemies, riding in royal chariots. Sometimes she appears alone, her silhouette tall, her jaw strong, her body curved in elegance and control. These were not just portraits, they were messages, symbols, a new visual language for a new world. She wore the blue crown of royalty, not always reserved for queens, and wielded the sceptre of divine rule. Her daughters are seen beside her, tender and playful, in scenes of surprising intimacy. Gone were the stiff, timeless poses of past dynasties. Here there was laughter, movement, touch, and then there was the bust. Unearthed in 1912 from the ruins of a sculptor's workshop, the bust of Nefertiti became one of the most iconic images of ancient beauty. Carved from limestone, painted with the colours of life, it shows her serene and composed, one eye missing, yet still arresting. It is quiet, regal, magnetic. The slight curve of her lips, the perfect arch of her brow, a face that holds both strength and peace. But more than beauty, it was strategy. This was no mere celebration of aesthetics. It was propaganda, a visual sermon preaching legitimacy, divinity, control. Every statue, every painting, every carved wall, all told the same story. This queen was not just a woman. She was a living symbol of divine rule. She was the light of the Aten, cast into human form, a disappearing crown, and then, like the sun at dusk, she vanished. Around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti disappears from the records. Her name stops appearing, her titles fade, her images grow fewer. The queen who had stood in sunlight, who had redefined power, slips into shadow. What happened to her? No one knows. Some scholars believe she died, perhaps in childbirth, or from illness, or quietly behind the palace walls. Others believe she changed her name and rose even higher, taking on the identity of Neferuaten, a mysterious co-regent who ruled beside Akhenaten in his final years. Still others whisper that she became pharaoh herself, the elusive Smenkhkare, whose reign was brief and puzzling. In this theory, Nefertiti took up the mantle of kingship after her husband's death, just as Hatshepsut had done a century before. But certainty remains out of reach. Her tomb has never been found. Her mummy remains unidentified, even in the valley of the kings where the dead speak in stone. Her silence lingers. After Akhenaten's death, the old gods returned. The city of Akhetaten was abandoned. The temples of Aten were dismantled, and the names of the heretic king Nanda and his queen were removed from the histories. The priesthood of Amun, once dethroned, reasserted its grip on memory itself. Nefertiti's sun had set, but it did not disappear. Her bust, her statues, the fragments of her story, all survived the erasure. And in the modern age, her name rose, again, like dawn over the desert. Scholars debated. Artists reimagined. The world once again looked into her painted eyes and asked, who was she? Tonight, as the stars stretch across your ceiling and the world softens around you, remember her, not just for her beauty, but for her brilliance, for the daring she carried, for the legacy she etched into time, not with weapons or war, but with vision, with faith, and with light. Nefertiti, Queen of the Sun, a name once forgotten, now never far from the lips of those who dream. Sleep. Well, dear dreamer, somewhere in the desert the light still glows. Chapter 3. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh. She was born into a world gilded with gold, shadowed by intrigue, and wrapped in centuries of tradition. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, came into the world not as a myth, but as a girl, by the Nile, raised in the palaces of Alexandria, where marble floors met turquoise seas and scrolls whispered knowledge from every corner. Her dynasty, the Ptolemies, had ruled for centuries, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. They were Greek in language, culture, and courtly customs, but Cleopatra would become something different, something ancient, something uniquely Egyptian. From a young age she was surrounded by luxury, but also instability. The palace was a hive of political games, shifting alliances, and rival claims. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XIII, was both king and puppet, a ruler kept on his throne not by Egyptian will, but by Roman influence. She watched as he navigated bribes and threats to maintain power, and she learned education was her armor. Cleopatra was not just well-read, she was brilliant. She studied philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. She learned to speak at least 7 languages, not just Greek and Latin, but also Egyptian, which her family had long neglected. She didn't just rule Egypt, she embraced it. By the time she came of age, Cleopatra had absorbed more than lessons. She had absorbed survival. She knew that a crown was not secured with lineage alone. It required cunning, charisma, and the ability to hold power in a world of collapsing empires. And that world was already shifting. Rome, once a republic, was becoming something more ruthless, and Egypt, though still golden, was drifting toward the edge of sovereignty. In this tension, Cleopatra rose, a young queen in a kingdom fading fast, Caesar and the crown. In 51 BCE, Cleopatra became co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy the and she was just 18, he only 10. It was a ceremonial partnership, but one that soured quickly. Court factions favored the boy. Cleopatra was pushed aside, exiled from her own palace, left to wander the edge of her empire while Alexandria turned against her. But Cleopatra was never one to fade quietly. She waited, watched, and when an opportunity came, she seized it. That opportunity arrived in the form of Julius Caesar. Rome's most powerful general had come to Alexandria chasing Pompey, his rival in civil war. Pompey had sought refuge with the young king, but was assassinated instead, an act meant to curry Caesar's favor, but one that chilled him instead. Into this charged moment stepped Cleopatra. Legend says she was smuggled into Caesar's quarters, rolled inside a carpet, a tale perhaps embellished, but one that captures the drama of her return. What matters more than how she arrived is what followed. Cleopatra did not beg, she did not plead. She made her case that Egypt needed stability and that she, not her brother, was its rightful leader. Caesar, seasoned and shrewd, listened. He saw more than a beautiful queen. He saw a potential ally. The result was swift. War broke out in Alexandria. Caesar backed Cleopatra. Ptolemy's forces resisted, but the tide turned. In the end, Ptolemy III drowned in the Nile. Cleopatra emerged as ruler and as Caesar's companion. She gave birth to a son Caesarion, Little Caesar. He was a symbol not just of their union, but of something larger, a bridge between East and West, between Egypt's ancient heritage and Rome's rising power. For a time, she followed Caesar to Rome, living not as a guest but as a queen in waiting. But when Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, everything shifted. Once again, she stood at a crossroads, a ruler without protection, a mother with a child linked to a murdered emperor. And once again, Cleopatra did not collapse. She returned to Egypt, rebuilt her strength, waited. The storm of Roman ambition had only begun. The queen and the general. In the years after Caesar's death, Rome fractured. 3 men rose to claim control: Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir; Lepidus, a fading shadow; and Mark Antony, soldier, orator, and Caesar's most trusted general. Antony held the eastern provinces, and so it was to Cleopatra he turned, calling her to Tarsus to account for her kingdom's loyalty. But Cleopatra never came to account. She came to enchant. She arrived on a golden barge, sails of purple silk billowing, musicians playing, her figure draped in goddess-like garments. She wasn't pleading for favor, she was performing divinity. Antony was captivated by her beauty, yes, but also her mind. Cleopatra was not a passive queen. She debated, she negotiated, she offered not herself, but an alliance, and he accepted. Their bond became both romantic and political. Antony needed Egypt's wealth and ships for his campaigns. Cleopatra needed Rome's protection. But it was more than strategy. They shared nights of laughter, philosophy, and wine. They created their own miniature court, a blend of Roman discipline and Egyptian luxury. She bore him 3 children. Their statues stood side by side. Their coins bore both their names. In Alexandria, they were gods reborn. But in Rome, this love was scandal. Octavian, hungry for sole control, began to turn opinion against them. He painted Cleopatra as a temptress, a foreign queen who had bewitched Antony and lured him away from his duty. It was a smear campaign, powerful, effective, and fatal. When Antony declared Caesarion as Caesar's rightful heir, Octavian declared war, not against Antony, against Cleopatra. It would be Egypt's final war, fall of an empire, the waters off. Actium shimmered with tension. In 31 BCE, the fleets of Octavian and the forces of Antony and Cleopatra met in battle. Wind, fire, and betrayal tore through the waves. The Egyptian-Roman forces were strong, but the tide turned against them. Cleopatra, seeing the battle lost, fled. Antony followed. Their ships retreated. Their hopes burned. Back in Alexandria, the end unfolded slowly. Antony, broken by defeat, fell on his sword. Cleopatra, devastated, locked herself in her mausoleum, surrounded by gold and memory. The city fell. Octavian entered as a conqueror. He demanded Cleopatra surrender, march in chains through Rome, live as a relic of his victory. She refused. On August 12, 30 BCE, Cleopatra took her own life. The exact means remains debated: snakebite, poison, or blade. But the result is clear. She chose death over humiliation, over erasure. She was 39 years old. With her death, Egypt fell. Rome took the Nile. Caesarion was killed. The line of pharaohs ended. A civilization that had endured for 3,000 years bowed finally to the legions of empire, but Cleopatra did not vanish. Her image, like her memory, endured, in marble busts, in whispered stories, in myths, both true and false, painted as villain, heroine, goddess, lover, rewritten by poets, historians, and dreamers alike. She was not perfect, she was not always kind, but she was brilliant, strategic, multilingual, and fiercely loyal to her land. She was a queen who fought to preserve her people, her lineage, her legacy. And in doing so, she became more than a ruler. She became legend. Tonight, as the moon rises over ancient ruins and the sea stirs softly against forgotten shores, remember her, not for her lovers, but for her mind, not for her downfall, but for her defiance. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, the woman who stood at the edge of an empire and dared to be more. Sleep gently, dreamer. The Nile still flows, and her story still shines. Chapter 4. Empress Lu Ji, the woman behind the dragon throne. Long before she wore the robes of command or whispered policies behind palace screens, Lu Ji was a quiet presence on the edge of history. Born into a modest but respected family, during the late Qin dynasty, she would enter the world of power not with a sword in hand, but with patience in her eyes. Her father, Lu Wen, was a magistrate, a man of structure, learning, and modest ambition. In those early years, Lu Ji's life was shaped more by discipline than grandeur. But tides were turning in China, and the crumbling of the Qin offered space for new beginnings. It was through marriage, not inheritance, that she entered the great halls of history. She became the wife of Liu Bang, a rough but cunning man with dreams too large for his village roots. Together they navigated the violent collapse of a dynasty. Together they would rise, though only one would leave the deepest mark. When Liu Bang declared himself emperor in 202 BCE, founding the Han dynasty and taking the title Emperor Gaozu, Lu Ji was elevated to empress. But even then she remained in the shadows, watching court life swirl like silk in the wind. She had no grand titles of her own, no command of troops, no open claim to rule. But she listened, she remembered. And when the emperor turned his eye toward other women, especially a favoured concubine named Lady Qi, Lu Ji did not protest. She waited. She understood the court. She understood survival. And she understood that power, when held quietly, could outlast even the loudest voices in the hall, the puppet emperors. When Emperor Gaozu died in 195 BCE, a fragile silence settled over the court. The great founder of the Han was gone, and the empire he built now rested in uncertain hands. His chosen heir, Emperor Hui, was still young, gentle, unfit perhaps for the kind of rule his father had imagined. But for Lu Ji it was a window. She stepped into the role of Empress Dowager. The emperor's mother, yes, but more importantly, the hidden architect of the throne. In the tradition of imperial China, the Empress Dowager held respect. Lu Ji turned that respect into reign. Her son, though emperor in name, was no match for her in courtcraft. He was kind-hearted, reluctant to punish, eager for peace. Lu Ji, in contrast, governed with a will sharpened by years of quiet observation. She handled decisions, appointed officials, and ensured that all who held real power reported to her. And when Emperor Hui died after a short reign, leaving no adult heirs, Lu Ji remained undisturbed by the change. She placed one child on the throne after another, each too young to resist, too weak to question. Puppet emperors, each crowned in gold but hollow in voice, behind them she ruled. Her technique was not theatrical. There were no proclamations of dominance, no grand speeches. Instead, she relied on ceremony, tradition, and a deep understanding of Confucian structures. Ministers feared her. Nobles bowed, and the empire, vast, intricate, and still recovering from the Qin's collapse, followed her lead. Yet all of it came cloaked in silk. She did not title herself as ruler. She did not sit openly on the dragon throne. But in the quiet folds of the palace, her word-shaped laws silenced opposition and redrew the lines of succession, silk glove, iron rule. But not all was calm beneath her silk sleeves. Beneath the rituals and quiet orders, Empress Lu Ji held a core of steel, and those who crossed her would come to know it. Her most infamous decision began with jealousy, but ended in horror. Lady Qi, the concubine once adored by Emperor Gaozu, had borne him a son. That son, Liu Ruyi, was a threat to Lu Ji's own lineage, and so the Empress Dowager acted. Lady Qi was imprisoned in the palace, not simply removed, but erased. Slowly, methodically, Lu Ji orchestrated a punishment that would echo for centuries. Lady Qi was mutilated, silenced, and left to wander the palace grounds as a ghost in flesh. Her son, young and innocent, was summoned to court, and quietly, poisoned. Even in a world where power often meant cruelty, this act stood apart. It was whispered in the corners of history, passed on not as law but as legend, a story of vengeance that chilled even hardened ministers. But Lu Ji's actions were not born of madness, they were calculated. Every move served a purpose: to protect her lineage, to secure her legacy, to ensure that no rival child could ever threaten the dynasty she had helped shape. And so she continued to rule, shrewd, composed, and unyielding. Beneath her reign, China stabilized, roads were rebuilt, taxes adjusted, borders secured. She promoted officials based on loyalty and talent. She did not seek war, she sought control. And she kept it. Not with banners or battles, but with alliances, removals, and a mind sharper than any sword. Legacy of power. When Lu Ji died in 180 BCE, the silence that followed was not one of grief, but of tension released. For nearly 2 decades, she had ruled from behind veils, folding her authority into the very walls of the palace. She had placed members of her own Lu clan into powerful positions, built a network that extended through every court office, and shaped succession as she saw fit. But when her breath ceased, her protection did too, and those loyal to the Han bloodline rose swiftly. The Lu clan was purged, her relatives executed, the puppet emperors deposed. In their place the court crowned a new ruler, Emperor Wen, a distant relative from the Liu family. A restoration, the ministers said, a return to rightful blood. But even as her name was removed from public rituals, her impact could not be erased. The Han dynasty survived because she held it steady. She had not shattered the empire, she had preserved it. In her cold calculations there had been stability. In her control there had been order. To some she remained a villain, a warning whispered to future rulers about what power could become. To others she was a force, a woman who shaped an empire through intellect and patience, through strategy and silence. In the end, history did not forget her. It could not. She was China's first woman ruler, not by birthright, but by will, and tonight, as paper lanterns drift over quiet waters and moonlight softens the outlines of ancient halls, we remember her not for the warmth she offered, but for the strength she held. Empress Lu Ji, the woman behind the dragon throne. She did not speak loudly. She did not reign from a battlefield, but she ruled completely. Sleep gently now, dear dreamer. Let history drift through you like the hush of silk, and let the memory of power come not in thunder, but in silence. Chapter 5. Empress Wu Zetian, the Empress of all under heaven. In the hushed corridors of a palace bound by ritual and shadow, a young girl once watched the silk-clad dancers, not for beauty, but for power. She listened more than she spoke. She memorized more than she mimicked, and though her name was yet unknown to the world, she would one day shape the future of China itself. She was Wu Zhao, born in the year 624, during the mighty Tang dynasty, an age of golden poetry, brilliant governance, and imperial splendor. Her family, while not nobility, was comfortable. Her father, a timber official, had connections at court. This gave young Wu Zhao something few girls in her position ever received, an education. She learned to read, to write poetry, to study history. Her mind, like ink across parchment, stretched far beyond the courtyards of her childhood. By the Age of 14, she was summoned to the imperial court as a concubine to Emperor Taizong. Among the hundreds of women in the palace, Wu Zhao was barely noticed. She was ranked low, too young, too quiet. Her duties were ceremonial, her robes humble. But still, she watched. She learned how decisions were made, how whispers moved, faster than commands, how loyalty could bend like bamboo in the wind. When Emperor Taizong died, custom demanded that his concubines without children retire to a convent. Wu Zhao did as tradition required, but her story would not end in silence. Years later, when the new emperor, Taizong's son Gaozong, visited the temple, Wu Zhao returned to his site. What passed between them remains lost to history, but what followed is certain. She re-entered the court not as a servant of tradition, but as a woman on the path to rule. Becoming emperor, the rise of Wu Zhao from imperial concubine to ruler of China was not swift, but it was unstoppable. A quiet river growing into a wide, commanding sea. Emperor Gaozong favored her, and soon she eclipsed his empress. But favor alone was never enough. In a court where every gesture was watched, Wu Zhao played the long game. She built alliances, she studied Confucian doctrine, then learned how to challenge it from within. When the empress tried to disgrace her, Wu Zhao turned accusation into opportunity. Through calculated moves, some say ruthless, some say brilliant, she secured the emperor's trust and displaced the empress herself. She became empress. Wu, the highest-ranking woman in the empire. But she wanted more than rank. She wanted power. When Gaozong suffered a stroke and grew weak, Wu began to rule in his stead. She sat behind a silken screen, issuing orders in his name, but her voice was the one that ministers obeyed. She reformed the bureaucracy, cracking down on corruption, replacing aristocrats with scholars who had risen through examination and merit. She strengthened the imperial police, secured the borders, and improved agriculture and education. After Emperor Gaozong's death, Wu ruled through her sons, puppet emperors, chosen and dismissed as she saw fit. Ministers protested. Confucian scholars decried her as unnatural, a woman ruling men. But the people saw something else. They saw order. Roads improved. Grain moved freely. Borders held firm. In 690, Wu Zetian did what no woman before or after would dare. She declared herself emperor, founding the Zhou dynasty and placing herself, officially and openly, at the center of all under heaven. Heaven's mandate. How could a woman rule in a world built for men? Wu Zetian answered not with rebellion, but with reason. She claimed the mandate of heaven, the divine approval that justified every Chinese dynasty. But she reimagined what that mandate meant. She sponsored Buddhist scripture and commissioned a new sutra, one that described a female monarch blessed by the divine. She elevated Buddhism as a spiritual counterbalance to Confucianism, whose rigid patriarchy opposed her presence. She positioned herself not as a threat to tradition, but as its fulfillment, a living bodhisattva, a bringer of peace, a guardian of all beings, and her governance reflected that conviction. She raised taxes on powerful nobles and used the funds to support public works, schools, and temples. She encouraged the education of girls, promoted officials based on exams rather than family name, and kept the court closely monitored to root out dissent. But power came at a cost. Wu's rule was not gentle. Suspected traitors disappeared. enemies were quietly removed. Loyalty was rewarded, disloyalty met silence, or worse. She ruled with eyes everywhere, and while her hand offered reform, it also carried consequence. Yet the empire, beneath her guidance, remained stable and prosperous. She expanded diplomacy, maintained peace with Korea, and nurtured art, poetry, and the recording of history. She placed large mirrors in her court, a symbolic reminder that self-reflection was as necessary as strength. Wu Zetian understood the dual nature of power, its ability to uplift and its danger to devour. And so she ruled with both hands, one open, one closed, legacy in stone and scroll. In the winter of 705, Wu Zetian, now aged and ailing, was forced to abdicate. Ministers loyal to the Tang family pressured her to step down. She died shortly after, the only woman in Chinese history to have ruled in her own name over an empire of millions. Her tomb lies in the Qianling Mausoleum, carved into the mountains near Xi'an. Beside her lies Emperor Gaozong, her partner, in title if not always in power, but what is most striking is her epitaph. Unlike every other emperor whose deeds were inscribed in stone, Wu Zetian's epitaph was left blank, a smooth, uncarved tablet, a deliberate silence. Scholars have debated the meaning. Was it an act of erasure, a refusal to record her reign? Or was it something else, a challenge, an invitation, a monument not to how she should be remembered, but to how each generation must choose to remember her? For centuries, Confucian historians painted her as a villain, cunning, cruel, unnatural. But in recent decades, her image has shifted. Today, she is seen not just as an exception to male power, but as a visionary, one who ruled effectively, built lasting systems, and expanded what was possible for women in leadership. She was neither saint nor tyrant. She was something more rare, a ruler who held the world in balance, who broke every boundary and still walked in ceremony. As we close our eyes tonight and listen to the echoes of history, we hear not just the clamour of emperors, but the quiet, decisive steps of a woman who dared to write her name into a world that did not want her to. She did not ask for permission. She made her own place. And even in silence, her story still stands. Sleep well now, dear dreamer. Let the lanterns of Chang'an flicker in the dusk of your thoughts. Let stone and scroll whisper of power, of vision, of a woman who became the empress of all under heaven. Chapter 6. Empress Suiko, the silent architect of harmony. In the old Yamato court, where whispers carried more weight than shouts, a young girl walked the polished wooden corridors in quiet observation. She was born into nobility, a princess, among many in a time when family lineage determined destiny, but not necessarily power. Her name was Suiko, though at birth she was simply one of many daughters, tucked behind the bold ambitions of fathers, brothers, and uncles. The palace was a world of ceremony. Draped curtains, soft rustling silks, and the scent of incense marked every day. But behind the elegance was something more dangerous. The tension of rival clans, the invisible line between loyalty and betrayal. The Soga and Mononobe families, each deeply rooted in ancient Shinto traditions, held much of the power behind the throne. Suiko watched them closely, not as a participant, but as a student. She learned not to speak hastily, not to move unnecessarily. Her silence became her shield. From a young age, Suiko was taught the rites of purification, the sacred songs and the genealogies of divine emperors, all part of the old way. But she also listened to stories of a newer belief, carried over, seized by monks from the continent, the teachings of the Buddha. At first, these teachings were spoken of in hushed tones, strange, foreign, even unwelcome. Yet, to Suiko, they were like a calm breeze through the dense forest of tradition. She grew up not by asserting herself, but by mastering the art of understanding. While others argued, she listened. While others sought dominance, she waited. It was not weakness, it was preparation. The years passed. Suiko married Emperor Bidatsu, becoming one of his consorts. When he died, the court again became a place of maneuvering and struggle. But Suiko remained still, quiet, watching from the edges of power. What no one expected was that the silent girl in the shadows would soon become the soul of a changing nation. The curtain is drawn back. In 593, a sudden shift rippled through the court. Assassinations and clan rivalries left the throne vulnerable. For the first time in Japan's history, the need arose for a sovereign who could unify without provocation. Someone steady, sacred, and above reproach. It was Suiko they turned to. Though rare for a woman to ascend in such a role, her lineage made her acceptable, and her temperament made her ideal. She was crowned not with trumpets or fanfare, but with a sense of quiet necessity. She became the 33rd sovereign of Japan, and the first woman in recorded history to rule in her own name. Yet the court did not erupt in rebellion. Instead, a hush fell over the land, not of silence, but of calm expectancy. Suiko did not challenge traditions openly. She didn't stride into power like a conqueror. Instead, she ruled with restraint. Her strength was subtle, like water slowly carving stone, and while she took the title of Empress, she understood the fragile nature of power. She needed support, someone who could match her quiet wisdom with bold vision. That someone was Prince Shotoku. Together they became a pair unlike any before. Them, she, the sovereign with the sacred bloodline, he, the thinker, the reformer, the spiritual architect of the age. While Suiko held the throne, Shotoku acted as her regent. Yet it was never clear who truly led. That, perhaps, was part of their genius. Under Suiko's rule, the court adopted new codes, reaching toward the structure and culture of China's great dynasties. She approved the construction of temples, encouraged the learning of Buddhist scripture, and supported the creation of Japan's earliest written histories. All of it done without fanfare. She didn't need to be praised. She only needed the work to endure. Through her, the court began to believe that peace was not just the absence of war. It was a harmony of purpose. With Shotoku by her side, Shotoku was not just her nephew. He was her counterpart. Where Suiko was serene and deliberate, Shotoku was visionary and eloquent. He spoke often of moral government, of the 17-article constitution he helped write, urging the court to act with justice, humility, and compassion. Though Suiko herself did not pen these reforms, nothing would have moved without her steady hand allowing it. Together they redefined leadership. Their reign was not based on force, but on the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. This was revolutionary in an age where most rulers sought to dominate through military strength or lineage alone. Suiko and Shotoku encouraged relations with China, sending envoys to the Sui dynasty. These exchanges opened doors to new technologies, philosophies and statecraft. Japan, once insular and fragmented, began to take shape as a unified culture. But it was not only foreign ideas they welcomed, it was a new way of thinking about identity. What did it mean to be Japanese? What role would faith play in this emerging sense of self? As temples rose across the land, Suiko gave royal patronage to Buddhism, yet she did not reject the native gods. She understood the soul of her people could not be torn from its roots, and so she sought a path of inclusion, not opposition. This balancing act was not easy, and many in the court grumbled at the changes. Still, Suiko pressed on, not with decrees or punishments, but by allowing transformation to bloom quietly under her reign. She had no need to outshine Shotoku. Their shared legacy was proof that harmony between woman and man, ruler and regent, old and new, could become the bedrock of a civilization. The path of two faiths. The land of Japan was ancient, long before Buddhism arrived. The people believed in kami, divine spirits found in rivers, trees, mountains, and ancestors. These spirits were intimate, native, and deeply tied to place. Buddhism, by contrast, spoke of detachment, impermanence, and the path to liberation from suffering. At first, the two seemed incompatible. Suiko saw otherwise. She did not attempt to erase one in favor of the other. Instead, she supported the coexistence of both. Temples were built beside shrines. Rituals continued, even as monks chanted sutras. A new spiritual identity began to take shape, one that honored the old while embracing the wisdom of the new. This harmony between Shinto and Buddhism became a hallmark of Japanese identity, lasting centuries. And at its heart was Suiko, the silent architect. She issued imperial edicts supporting the construction of Asuka-dera, one of the earliest Buddhist temples. She promoted Buddhist holidays, invited monks to the court, and encouraged translation of scriptures. Yet she never forced the faith. Her strength lay in allowing the people to explore, to decide, to grow. This dual path brought peace. Where once there was tension between the clans, some devoted to kami, others to the Buddha, now there was a bridge. Under Suiko's guidance, Japan learned that devotion could take many forms and that unity did not require uniformity. In 628, Empress Suiko passed from this world. She had reigned for 35 years, one of the longest of any ruler at the time. She left behind no battlefield victories, no grand conquests. Instead, she left something deeper, a cultural and spiritual foundation that would shape Japan for 1,000 years. Her name, once spoken in whispers behind curtained halls, became a symbol of peace. And though history often credits her nephew for the age's brilliance, those who look closely can still see her hand, gently guiding, gracefully enduring, silently building a nation's soul. Chapter 7. Queen Boudica, the Flame of Britannia. In the mist-veiled lands of ancient Britannia, where the forests whispered and rivers remembered, there ruled a queen with auburn hair and fire in her heart. Her name was Boudica, sovereign of the Iceni, a proud tribe nestled in the eastern lands of what is now Norfolk. She had not sought conflict, she had not dreamed of war. She had ruled beside her husband King Prasutagus in uneasy peace under Roman shadow, but the peace was not equal, and the Romans, for all their polished civility, knew conquest better than justice. When Prasutagus died, he left behind not only his kingdom, but a will, one that named his daughters and the Roman emperor as co-heirs, hoping to protect his lineage and people from Roman greed. But Rome did not honor the pact. They dishonored it in full. Roman officials stormed into Iceni lands and declared the kingdom for themselves. Boudica objected, and for this she was seized. Before her people, before her daughters, she was stripped, whipped, and humiliated. Her daughters, still girls, were violated. What had been meant as intimidation became a wound that bled into history. The Romans thought they had silenced her. But in that moment, something ancient and sacred rose within her. A queen's cry turned to a mother's fury, and that fury became a roar that would shake an empire. Boudica did not crawl into shadows. She stood tall, bloodied but unbroken, and began to summon the storm. Not with pleas, not with petitions, but with fire. Rising from ash and blood, word spread quickly through the tribes of the injustice, the betrayal, the cruelty. Boudica became a symbol not only of vengeance, but of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, Rome could be answered. She travelled the wild lands of Britannia, speaking not with polished rhetoric, but with raw truth. She stood upon hilltops and sacred groves, wrapped in a cloak of wolf fur and purpose, her voice like thunder through the trees. She told the tale of her people, her daughters, her scars. And the tribes listened. The Iceni rose with her. So did the Trinovantes, and others who had long borne the weight of Roman rule. They brought spears, axes, and burning hearts. What they lacked in discipline, they carried in spirit. Some came barefoot, others with painted faces and charms carved from bone. They were farmers, hunters, daughters, sons, ordinary people summoned into a war by one woman's pain. It was said that Boudica rode in a chariot, her red hair streaming like a banner, her daughters beside her. Her eyes burned not with madness, but with clarity, the kind that only comes from loss. She did not beg for justice. She demanded it. The rebellion surged like a flood. Roman settlements, once considered untouchable, began to tremble. Their paved roads, their stone walls, their governors, none would be spared the storm Boudica carried on her shoulders. Fire over Londinium, the Roman town of Camulodunum, built atop sacred tribal land, was the first to fall. The rebels surrounded it and set it ablaze. Temples to Roman gods crumbled, statues melted. The settlers, colonists who had mocked native rituals and built shrines to their own power, were overrun. There was no mercy, only the scream of vengeance echoing through flame. Next came Londinium, a young Roman outpost newly rising in stature, full of traders and soldiers. It stood beside the river like a symbol of Rome's future. But Boudica did not see a city. She saw a wound, a promise of further domination, and she did what she had sworn to do. She burned it. Smoke curled into the sky, black as mourning cloth. The timber buildings collapsed under waves of flame. Roman soldiers, caught off guard, fled south. Citizens perished by the hundreds. The ground itself seemed to cry with the sound of collapsing stone and cracking earth. The fire was not wild. It was guided by purpose, a message that Britannia would not bow quietly. For a moment, the Romans feared they would lose the province entirely. Boudicca's army had grown to tens of thousands. Her rebellion was not a skirmish. It was an uprising. But Rome did not forget how to fight. Governor Suetonius regrouped. With precision and cold calculation, he planned a counter-strike. Boudicca, unaware of the exact strength behind Rome's response, moved forward with the same defiant courage that had carried her this far. She would not retreat. Not now. Not ever. The last stand. The final battle took place in a narrow valley where Roman tactics would have the upper hand. Boudicca's forces, vast and fiery, stretched out across the land, their numbers bold, but their order scattered. Suetonius placed his men in tight formations, shields interlocked, spears poised. The Roman legions were outnumbered, but not outmaneuvered. The clash began like a storm, wild, deafening, chaotic. Boudicca's warriors charged with cries that shook the air, but the Roman wall held. Again and again the Britons surged forward, only to meet a wall of iron and discipline. Behind the Britons stood their wagons, loaded with families who had come to witness their triumph. But now they trapped the retreat. There was nowhere to run. The field turned red. Spears shattered. Arrows flew. The morning turned to afternoon, and the rebellion began to crumble. When it was done, thousands lay still upon the earth. The fire had met stone, and the stone had prevailed. What became of Boudicca is wrapped in legend. Some say she drank poison, refusing to be paraded through Rome in chains. Others say she vanished into the woods, her chariot melting into myth. Her body was never found, but her spirit did not die. In the centuries to come, Boudicca would rise again, not in flesh, but in story. She became a symbol of defiance, a guardian of the land's memory. In times of war, she was evoked. In times of silence, she was remembered. She was not just a warrior, she was the voice of a people who refused to be forgotten. The flame she lit did not die with her body. It carried through the bones of the island, whispering to every generation that there is a time to endure and a time to rise. Chapter 8. Queen of Sheba, the Seeker of Wisdom. Before she ever stepped foot in Jerusalem, the Queen of Sheba was already wrapped in mystery. Some said she came from the southern lands of Arabia, where the incense trees grew wild and the mountains hid veins of gold. Others whispered she was born in the heart of Africa, in a kingdom where the rivers moved like mirrors and the earth itself sang with richness. Her true homeland remains a question, an echo from a time when history and myth often walked hand in hand. What is known is this: she was a queen in her own right, not the daughter of a king, not the wife of a prince, a sovereign ruler, commanding armies, trade routes, and loyalty, in a time when few women held thrones alone. Her land was one of spice and silk, where camels padded softly across ancient roads and perfumed markets bloomed with sound. Stories began to spread about her long before she met Solomon. Of her beauty, yes, but more than that, of her mind. Wise, clever, and calm. She was said to outwit generals, solve disputes with a word, and see through deception with the quiet gaze of someone who had studied both men and stars. Poets called her Bilqis. Others named her Makeda. But all agreed she was more than a ruler. She was a mystery made flesh, a monarch with a heart that longed not only for power or praise, but for understanding. And it was this longing that would carry her across sands and silence toward the greatest sage of her time. In the soft light of legend, she does not ride. She glides. Draped in flowing silks, veiled in gold dust, her caravans winding like rivers through the dunes. Wherever she came from, she brought with her the essence of something ancient, a woman forged in fire and silence, shaped not just by birthright, but by purpose. Across the incense road, the journey to Jerusalem was not easy. It was long, dangerous, slow. Her caravan stretched across the horizon like a golden thread, hundreds of camels, each bearing gifts. Spices that filled the air with sweetness, ivory that gleamed like starlight, precious stones that caught the sun. But these were not just offerings. They were symbols, signs that her mission was not conquest, but connection. The roads she travelled were older than memory. Known today as the incense route, these paths wound through harsh deserts and rocky cliffs, threading together kingdoms with trade, stories, and dust. Along these routes, great empires once whispered to one another, through gifts, through goods, and sometimes through silence. As her caravan moved forward, each mile tested her resolve. Nights brought freezing winds, days brought heat that burned through silk. Sandstorms would rise without warning, hiding the stars and erasing the path behind them. But still, she moved on. She was not just a queen on a journey, she was a seeker, drawn forward by something deeper than curiosity. Stories of King Solomon had reached even her distant kingdom, of his wisdom, his justice, his connection to the divine. And in his words, she hoped to find a mirror, a kindred mind, a glimpse of something eternal. So she pressed on past cities, carved in stone, past oases where water tasted like mercy, until the hills of Jerusalem rose before her, olive green, sun-soaked, and ancient. And there, at the gates of Solomon's kingdom, the queen did not kneel. She entered as an equal. Riddles and reverence. Their meeting has become legend, not for battles or treaties, but for questions. When the Queen of Sheba stood before Solomon, it was not with weapons or warnings. It was with riddles, ancient, strange, and profound. She did not come to test him as an enemy might, but as a seeker, to see if the stories were true, to see if his wisdom was real, not just in law or politics, but in the soul. The riddles she posed were not merely clever games. They were puzzles shaped by life, by sorrow, by beauty, by paradox, questions of meaning, of spirit, of truth hidden within simplicity. And Solomon, the wise king of Israel, answered them all, not with arrogance, but with grace. Theirs was a meeting of equals, of monarchs, yes, but more deeply of minds. Two rulers who saw in each other not just greatness, but reflection. Where others might have spoken in boasts, they spoke in symbols. Where others might have bargained, they shared. In some traditions it is said that Solomon showed her not just his palace but the temple, not just riches but the heart of his faith, the sacred rituals, the silence between the songs, the source of his wisdom. And in return she gave more than gifts. She gave insight, stories from her lands, knowledge of herbs, of stars, of things unseen by Solomon's court. There was reverence between them, a respect that reached beyond language or border, and perhaps, though the texts are gentle with their hints, something more. Not romance in the way poets often dream, but a deeper connection, a spiritual kinship. When she finally left Jerusalem, it was not as she came. She returned transformed, not in wealth or status, but in understanding. A kingdom remembered what she carried back was not only treasures, but truths. Her return journey was quiet, though still majestic. The roads were the same, but her heart was not. She had come seeking wisdom, and she had found it, not just in Solomon, but in herself. His answers had sparked her own, his temple had stirred her spirit, and in the silence of the journey home, something ancient within her had awakened. Back in her homeland, she ruled with a deeper stillness, the kind that comes not from silence, but from seeing. Her people spoke of how her eyes had changed, clearer, more distant, like they now saw things beyond what the world offered. Stories of her journey began to pass from mouth to mouth, from elder to child. In Ethiopia, she was remembered as the mother of kings, her line said to stretch through centuries, carrying wisdom like a bloodline. In Arabia, her name was spoken with awe, a queen who had dared to seek. And in the scriptures, she became more than a monarch. She became a symbol of courage, of insight, of the sacred path that wisdom demands. Legends grew, as legends do. Some said she bore a child by Solomon, a future king whose lineage would shake empires. Others said she returned to her land and built temples shaped by what she had seen in Jerusalem. Still others believed she vanished into myth, returning to the sand from which her story rose. But she has never been forgotten. Not truly. The Queen of Sheba remains, not just in books or ruins, but in every story of a soul who dares to seek the truth. In every journey taken not for conquest but for meaning. In every riddle that asks not for an answer, but for reverence. She is the queen who crossed deserts not to rule, but to understand. The seeker whose throne was built not just of gold, but of questions. And as the stars shift quietly above the ancient roads she once walked, her name is still whispered, not as history, but as legend. Chapter 9. Empress Theodora, the actress who ruled an empire. Long before the crown, before the palace walls and golden halls, there was a stage. And standing beneath flickering lamplight, dressed in colours meant to dazzle, was a girl named Theodora. She was not born into power. Her father was a bear trainer in Constantinople's hippodrome, the roaring arena where sports, spectacle and politics collided. When he died, her family lost their place in the world. Theodora, still a child, entered the world of performance by necessity, by survival. She became an actress, a word that carried shadows in Byzantine society. To act was to be seen, but never respected. To dance was to entertain, but not to belong. The line between performer and courtesan was thin, and Theodora crossed it often. Her name was whispered with both scandal and fascination, yet behind the coloured silks and painted eyes was a spirit that would not bend. She travelled far beyond Constantinople, to Alexandria, to the deserts of Egypt. She met monks and governors, lived alone, suffered illness, faced hunger, and somewhere in that exile, something within her changed. She turned toward stillness, toward faith, toward the fire of self-worth that cannot be put out by rumour or ridicule. By the time she returned to the capital, she was no longer the girl who danced for coins. She carried herself with quiet strength, not loud, not proud, but unshakable. Theodora had been shaped not by privilege but by pain, and it gave her something rare in a world of masks: authenticity. What began in the shadows was not shameful. It was the making of someone who would one day step through silk curtains into the halls of power, not as a decoration, but as an equal, the empress of the people. The story of Theodora's rise is as unexpected as it is true. Justinian, heir to the imperial throne, was no ordinary prince. He was brilliant, legal-minded, visionary, but he was also cautious, careful, until he met her. Theodora and Justinian's connection went beyond attraction. It was a meeting of minds and hearts. She was sharp, articulate, grounded by hardship. He was driven, focused, open to challenge. Their union was not merely romantic, it was strategic, transformative. There was one problem. The law forbade men of noble rank from marrying actresses, but Justinian changed that law, not just for himself, but for her. And with that act, Theodora stepped into history. As empress, she did not fade into the background. She stood beside Justinian as a co-ruler, a true partner in vision and voice. She wore silk, yes, but behind it was steel. She was not born into palaces, but she understood people. She remembered the hunger, the judgment, the fear, and it made her one of the most compassionate rulers Byzantium would ever know. She was no stranger to pain, and so she could govern with empathy. Women came to her court for help. The poor sought her mercy. And behind palace doors she became Justinian's most trusted advisor, influencing policy, guiding reform, holding her place at the center of an empire without apology. In a world that judged her past, she did not apologize for it. Instead, she used it to understand those no one else heard. The riot and the crown. Theodora's legacy was not written in silk and ceremony. It was forged in fire. In the year 532, Constantinople erupted into chaos. What began as a conflict between rival chariot factions, the Blues and the Greens, exploded into the Nika revolt. The people, already frustrated by taxes and corruption, stormed the streets. Fires raged, buildings crumbled, the city trembled. Justinian, stunned and overwhelmed, considered fleeing. The ships waited. The emperor's advisers urged escape. Theodora listened, then stood. Her words in that moment are still remembered. She did not plead. She did not shout. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and unshakable. She said, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." To live in fear, she implied, was not living at all. To run was to abandon duty, dignity, and destiny. Better to die as emperor and empress than to survive as cowards. Her courage held the crown in place. Justinian stayed. With renewed resolve, he and his generals acted swiftly. The revolt was crushed. Order returned. But it was Theodora's voice, not his sword, that saved the empire. This was not just a wife's bravery, it was the stance of a ruler. She had risen from the gutters, she had walked through fire. And when the empire's heart faltered, it was her steady hand that kept it beating. In the dark silence of crisis, it was not strategy or strength that turned the tide. It was a woman's courage. The hand behind reform empress, Theodora, did not only rule. She reshaped the world she ruled. Her influence stretched beyond palace walls, into law, into daily life, into the quiet moments where justice begins. She championed rights for women. She fought for protections others never considered. Brothels were closed. Trafficking was punished. She opened shelters for women with nowhere else to go. She made it harder for husbands to abandon their wives. She gave voice to those who had none. In the courts, she stood for fairness. In churches, she funded buildings of beauty and prayer. In politics, she matched Justinian, not in speeches, but in influence. She was often behind the curtain, but never out of sight. And through it all, she never forgot who she had been. She did not erase her past. She used it. Her power came not from pretending to be born noble, but from proving she could become something greater. When illness finally took her in her mid-40s, she left behind more than titles or jewels. She left behind change, structural, lasting, human. Her story is not soft. It is not neat. It is the story of a woman who lived every part of life. The struggle, the shame, the spotlight, the throne, and who never stopped using it for something more. Today, Theodora stands among the mosaics of Ravenna, her gaze calm, her crown golden. But her truest monument is in law books, in stories of the poor lifted up, and in every woman who ever dared to say, "I will not be defined by where I began." She was not just empress, she was will, compassion, fire behind silk. Chapter 10. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen who was a kingdom. In the warm hills of southwestern France, where vineyards rolled like painted waves and ancient songs drifted through castle courtyards, a child was born who would one day change the course of Europe. Her name was Eleanor, and her cradle was a court of poetry and power. Born in 1122 into the ruling family of Aquitaine, Eleanor inherited a duchy larger and richer than the lands of the French crown itself. Her father, Duke William X, was not only a powerful ruler but also a patron of the arts, encouraging the vibrant culture of troubadours, poets who sang of love, honor, and the mystery of the soul. Under his care, Eleanor was not raised as a passive heiress. She was taught to listen, to reason, and most of all to lead. Aquitaine was not a distant province. It was a living court, alive with the sounds of music, debate, and elegant festivities. It was a place where women could hold influence, where the court of love flourished, and where Eleanor, sharp of mind and independent in spirit, absorbed the rhythms of both power and art. She watched how words could move hearts, how alliances could be shaped with gestures more subtle than steel, and how leadership required both firmness and grace. When her father died on a pilgrimage in 1137, Eleanor, at only 15 years old, became Duchess of Aquitaine. But she inherited more than land. She inherited a legacy, one of freedom, strength, and the bold expectations of a people who had seen greatness. She was not merely expected to marry well, she was expected to rule well, and almost immediately that expectation drew the eyes of Europe's most powerful men. That same year, Eleanor was married to the young and newly crowned King Louis XVI of France, and thus began the life of a woman who would sit on 2 thrones, mother kings, challenge popes, and outlive nearly every man who ever tried to contain her. 2 thrones, 1 woman. The union between Eleanor and Louis was political in nature, but it was destined to fracture. Where she was lively, intelligent, and commanding, Louis was quiet, reserved, and pious. A monk at heart, not a warrior or ruler in spirit. The contrast was immediate, and it deepened with time. They travelled together, most famously to the Holy Land during the Second Crusade. Eleanor, ever bold, donned armour and rode with her own contingent of knights. She defied expectations by taking part not just as a queen, but as a leader in her own right. Yet the crusade was a failure, and it placed strain on their already fragile bond. There were whispers, accusations, a scandalous suggestion that she had become too close to her uncle Raymond of Antioch. Whether these were true or not, the outcome was clear. Eleanor and Louis grew apart. Their marriage produced only daughters, and in a kingdom that craved male heirs, the blame, unfairly, fell on her. In 1152, after 15 years of coldness and misunderstanding, their marriage was annulled. But Eleanor did not retreat in disgrace. Instead, she returned to Aquitaine with her titles, her dignity, and her power completely intact. Only 2 months later, she made a new match, this time with Henry, Duke of Normandy. He was 10 years her junior, ambitious, forceful, and intelligent. Their union was fiery from the beginning, driven by passion and a shared desire to rule. In 1154, when Henry became King Henry II of England, Eleanor became queen once again. This second marriage produced 8 children, including 2 sons who would both become kings, Richard the Lionheart and John of England. Together, Henry and Eleanor ruled a vast realm stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. It was the mightiest empire in Europe. And yet, despite their power, their marriage would become a battlefield. Henry was unfaithful. Eleanor, who had given him children and counsel, felt betrayed. She had not been raised to be submissive. She had not walked through courts of power only to be pushed into the shadows. Tension turned to conflict. And when their sons grew to challenge their father, Eleanor made a fateful choice. A lioness in chains. In 1173, 3 of Eleanor's sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, rose up in rebellion against their father. Their cause was personal and political. They felt sidelined, and they saw an opportunity to gain power. Eleanor supported them. It was a daring act. It was also dangerous. She aligned herself with her sons against the King of England, her husband. Whether she did so out of revenge, calculation, or maternal instinct, the result was the same: rebellion. The revolt ultimately failed. The sons were defeated and Eleanor was captured. She was arrested by Henry's forces while trying to flee and placed under guard, not in a prison cell, but in soft confinement across several castles. For the next 16 years, Eleanor remained a prisoner of the crown. While Henry ruled, she waited. Her world became quiet, yet inside she remained fierce. The lioness did not pace, she watched, she remembered. She prepared. Only in 1189, when Henry II died, did Eleanor step back into the light. Her son, Richard. Now Richard the Lionheart became king, and one of his first acts was to release her. She was 67 years old, and her most influential years were still to come. The Queen Mother of Empire. With Richard on the throne and preparing for crusade, Eleanor did not fade into comfort. Instead, she became the backbone of the realm, its wisdom, its memory, its guide. While Richard fought in the Holy Land, she governed in his name. She managed the court, negotiated peace with restive nobles, and even travelled to rescue him when he was captured and held for ransom. It was Eleanor who raised the enormous sum needed to secure his freedom, a testament to her enduring influence and the loyalty she inspired. After Richard's death in 1199, her youngest son John ascended the throne. Eleanor again lent her support, though the years had changed her. She was more cautious, more deliberate. She became a source of calm amid the turmoil of succession, balancing her love for her sons with the burden of her experience. Even in her 70s, she journeyed across the rugged lands of Castile and over the Pyrenees to arrange the marriage of her granddaughter to the heir of France, an act of diplomacy that shaped the next generation of kings. Her body may have aged, but her mind remained sharp, her will unbent. In 1204, at the age of 82, Eleanor of Aquitaine passed away at the Abbey of Fontevraud. She was laid to rest beside Henry II and Richard, two kings whose lives she had shaped, challenged, and outlasted. But her true legacy cannot be found in stone. It echoes in the halls of history, in every queen who dared to speak, in every woman who refused to be defined by the men around her, in the songs of poets, in the decisions of rulers, in the maps of kingdoms shaped not only by swords, but by the will of a woman who never stopped ruling. Eleanor was not simply Queen of France or Queen of England. She was Aquitaine. She was poetry. She was rebellious and reasoned. She was and remains a kingdom all her own. Chapter 11. Isabella I of Castile, the architect of a nation. In a world where daughters were traded for alliances and queens rarely chose their paths, Isabella of Castile carved her own. She was born in 1451 in a land caught between chaos and change. Castile, one of the largest kingdoms in Iberia, was fractured by rival claims and the ambitions of noble houses. Her early years were spent not in peace, but in uncertainty. Her father died while she was still young. Her half-brother, King Henry IV, ruled with weakness and indecision. At court, whispers swirled, loyalty shifted, and everyone waited to see who would rise. From a young age, Isabella showed signs of quiet strength. She was pious, but not passive, observant, but not silent. Unlike many royal daughters, she resisted being placed like a pawn in someone else's game. When Henry tried to force her into a politically convenient marriage with a powerful but untrusted noble, Isabella refused. Again and again she was pushed toward alliances she did not want. Each time she pushed back. Then came Ferdinand, the Prince of Aragon. A match that was both romantic and strategic. Together they represented something rare in royal unions: balance. Isabella knew that marrying him would not only protect her claim to the Castilian throne, but also lay the foundation for something greater. In 1469, without her brother's blessing, and at great personal risk, Isabella married Ferdinand in secret. It was a bold move, a defiant one, and when her brother died 5 years later, the throne of Castile did not fall quietly into her hands. She had to fight for it, politically, legally, and emotionally. But she won. In 1474, Isabella was crowned queen in her own right. Not a consort, not a shadow, but a sovereign. The crown she wore was one she claimed with courage, and with it she began building a vision that would shape the future of a nation. War and wedding. The union of Isabella and Ferdinand marked the beginning of one of history's most powerful dynasties. Together they were known as the Catholic monarchs, a partnership in both marriage and rule. Yet their path to uniting Spain was neither easy nor bloodless. Their early years on the throne were defined by war. First came civil conflict. Some Castilian nobles had backed a rival claimant, Isabella's niece, Juana. The dispute erupted into a long, bitter war, complicated by Portugal's intervention and the ever-shifting loyalties of Spain's powerful houses. Isabella, though young, was relentless. She rode with her armies, consulted with generals, and held her ground through sieges and betrayals. Her leadership was not showy, but it was unshakable. She kept order, inspired loyalty, and, perhaps most importantly, never broke from the image of strength. Even when surrounded by enemies, Isabella made it clear she would not be pushed from the throne. Ferdinand fought alongside her, especially in the later phases of war, but it was Isabella who remained the beating heart of Castile. By 1479 their position was secure. The marriage had survived war, and the crowns of Castile and Aragon, though technically separate, now moved together side by side. Spain, as it would come to be known, was being born. Their next mission was spiritual and territorial. For centuries, Christian and Muslim kingdoms had fought across the Iberian Peninsula. The last Muslim stronghold, Granada, remained, a gleaming city of culture, faith, and resistance. The Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to retake Spain, was nearing its final act. For 10 long years, Isabella and Ferdinand waged war against Granada. It was a slow, grueling campaign marked by sieges, diplomacy, and immense cost. Yet through it all, Isabella remained deeply involved. She funded the campaign, managed supply lines, and personally visited camps. Her presence, always composed, always commanding, was felt in every victory. By 1492, the red banners of Castile flew over the Alhambra. Granada had fallen. Spain was united under one crown, one language, one faith. It was a moment of triumph, but it was also a threshold, the start of an age both glorious and grave. 90. A year of earthquakes. History often moves slowly, but sometimes it turns on a single year. For Isabella and for Spain, that year was 1492. Granada fell in January, and the centuries-old dream of a unified Christian Spain was fulfilled. But the victory came with a cost. The surrender of Granada included promises of religious freedom for its Muslim population. Yet those promises would not last. That same year, Isabella and Ferdinand made a decision that would echo for centuries. They agreed to sponsor a daring sailor named Christopher Columbus, a Genoese navigator with bold dreams of sailing west to reach Asia. Others had dismissed him. But Isabella saw something in his vision, a chance for Spain to reach beyond its shores and claim a new kind of glory. Columbus was granted ships, supplies, and royal favour. When he set sail across the Atlantic, few expected much. When he returned, claiming to have reached the Indies, the world changed. Unknowingly, Isabella had helped open the door to the Americas. Colonization, conquest, and empire would follow. What began as a voyage of exploration would become one of the most defining forces in global history. The age of discovery had begun, and Spain would rise as its leading power. But not all change was expansion. 1492 also brought a more solemn act. That spring, Isabella and Ferdinand issued the Alhambra Decree, an edict ordering the expulsion of all practicing Jews from Spain. Many had lived in Spain for centuries, contributing to science, medicine, philosophy, and art. Now they were told to convert or leave. Thousands fled. Many died. It was a turning point, the end of a long chapter of coexistence and the beginning of a harsher religious order. This year, a triumph, exploration, and intolerance revealed the heart of Isabella's reign, visionary, determined, unyielding, but not without consequences. To some, she was the mother of empire. To others, the architect of exile, faith, and fire. Isabella's faith was central to her identity. She believed her rule was guided by divine purpose, that unity in faith was the key to national strength. This belief shaped her policies. With the fall of Granada, Isabella felt it was time to complete the spiritual conquest of Spain. Jews were expelled, Muslims were pressured to convert, and in 1478, before Granada had even fallen, she and Ferdinand had requested the creation of the Spanish Inquisition. The Inquisition was not immediate terror. At first, it moved slowly with trials and hearings, but over time it grew harsher, hunting down those accused of heresy, forcing confessions, and punishing those who strayed from the Catholic path. Isabella did not see this as cruelty. She saw it as protection. To her, unity was survival, a fortress against chaos, against invasion, against decay. And yet the cost was high. Communities shattered. Fear took root. Diversity, once a hallmark of Iberia, was reduced to silence. Despite this, Isabella was deeply respected. Even her enemies often admired her discipline, her intellect, her unwavering commitment. She was not a queen of indulgence. She lived simply. She dressed modestly. She was a ruler first, always. Her final years were spent managing succession, securing her children's futures, and shaping Spain's new place in the world. She died in 1504, her body worn, her vision fulfilled. Isabella left behind a united kingdom, a growing empire, and a complex legacy. She had begun as a young girl defying a king's wishes. She ended as one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Her reign built bridges across oceans, across kingdoms. It also burned others with fire, with force, with faith. To some, she was a saint. To others, a tyrant. But to history, she was something rarer still. A woman who ruled not beside power, but as power itself. Chapter 12. Catherine de' Medici, the queen behind the veil. She was born into one of Europe's richest banking families, the Medici of Florence, but her early life was not charmed. Catherine de' Medici came into the world in 1519, and within days her mother was gone. Within weeks, so was her father. An orphaned child with a powerful name and no parents, she became a political pawn in the shifting tides of Italian power. In her youth, she was hidden away during uprisings, locked in convents, kept under watch. But even in confinement, Catherine was being shaped, not with swords or crowns, but with silence, resilience, and the long memory of betrayal. In 1533, at just 14, Catherine was sent across the Alps to France. Her marriage to Prince Henry, the second son of King Francis III, though, was meant to forge an alliance between Florence and the French crown. She arrived not as a celebrated royal bride, but as a quiet girl with foreign blood and no dowry of real power. At the court, she was overlooked. Her husband ignored her. The nobles whispered about her roots. But Catherine watched and waited. Fate shifted. When Henry's elder brother died suddenly, Catherine became Dauphine, next in line to be queen. In 1547, Henry ascended the throne. Catherine, now Queen of France, stepped onto a stage more dangerous than any battlefield, the royal court. She was still seen as Italian, as an outsider. But she had learned from Florence the art of appearances, the danger of favour, and the long game of survival. She played it well. Behind her stillness was strategy. Behind her soft eyes, calculation. She was not yet a ruler, not truly, but the seed of something lasting had already been planted. Mother of kings, Catherine's marriage to Henry II brought her 10 children, 3 of whom would wear the French crown, but her power bloomed only after his death. In 1559, a jousting accident took Henry's life. His sudden death shattered the court, and into that vacuum of grief and confusion, Catherine stepped forward, not as a mourning widow, but as regent to her young son, King Francis II. She was now a mother with a crown in her hands, and enemies at every corner. Francis II was fragile, and his reign lasted barely a year. He died at 16. Catherine's second son, Charles IX, ascended next. He was only 10. Once again, Catherine became regent, the true power behind the throne. She governed while he grew, shielding him from chaos while trying to hold a fractured realm together. France was crumbling under the weight of religious war. Catholic and Protestant factions tore cities apart. Old noble houses used the chaos to chase their own ambitions, and through it all, Catherine maneuvered carefully, endlessly, to preserve the throne for her children. She sought balance, sometimes leaning Catholic, sometimes opening doors to Protestant reformers. She called councils, arranged marriages, ordered arrests, always negotiating, always adjusting. But power never comes cleanly. Her third son, Henry III, eventually ruled. By then France was splintered. Catherine remained at his side, a mother, still, but also a stateswoman, guiding, defending, calculating the lesser evils of an age that offered few good choices. She did not wield power from a throne. She wove it from behind veils of motherhood, of widowhood, of tradition. In that shadowed space, she survived, and in surviving, she ruled. Court of Shadows. The French court under Catherine was a place of luxury and of suspicion. She filled the halls of her palaces with art and music, tapestries from Flanders, silks from the East. She brought Italian refinement to France, pageants, banquets, astrology, dancing. She fostered thinkers and architects, building gardens that seemed to stretch into dreams, but behind the elegance, shadows crept. She surrounded herself with spies, listened carefully, trusted few. Her court became famous, or infamous, for masks, secrets, and whispered schemes. She kept her enemies close, sometimes in chains, sometimes in conversation. Catherine also had a hunger for the spiritual, not faith in the formal sense, but something deeper, a desire to know, to predict, to prevent. She consulted astrologers, kept company with mystics. Nostradamus visited her court. She read stars not for wonder, but for warning. She built secret staircases, hidden passages, escape routes. She had known what it was to be hunted as a child, and never forgot. To outsiders, her court looked like a dream, but within it was a stage where every gesture could cost a life. And Catherine, seated in silence, played conductor to it all. It was a world built on appearances, held together by her will. A fragile balance of light and dark, beauty and fear. Her sons ruled in name, but it was she who stitched together each brittle day. St. Bartholomew's Night, in 1572, Catherine made a decision, one meant to end conflict, but that would mark her legacy forever. Her daughter Marguerite was to marry Henry of Navarre, a Protestant noble and future king. The wedding was meant to signal peace, a joining of Catholic and Protestant blood. The city of Paris was filled with guests. The mood was tense but hopeful. Then days after the wedding, the mood shifted. On the night of August 23rd, as bells echoed through Paris, Catholic forces, most likely with royal backing, began to kill Protestant leaders. The violence spread from noble homes to city streets, from targeted strikes to a frenzy of blood. By morning, thousands were dead. This was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, one of the darkest nights in France's long history. Catherine's exact role remains debated. Some say she ordered it, others say she allowed it. Still others say she tried to contain it, and failed. But her name would always be tied to that night, to the fear, the fire, and the screams in the streets of Paris. The massacre did not bring peace. It deepened. The wounds. Protestant nations recoiled. The wars in France raged on. And though her son Henry III continued to rule, the crown was tarnished, heavy with guilt, unsteady with grief. Catherine spent her last years trying to mend what had been broken. She negotiated. She offered marriages. She travelled until her body ached. She died in 1589, just months before Henry III was assassinated. 3 sons had ruled. None had sons of their own. With their deaths, Catherine's bloodline ended, and the throne passed into new hands, but her presence, veiled, powerful, and mysterious, never truly faded. She remains one of the most complicated queens in history, a woman of faith and force, of opulence and restraint, of fear and love, a queen behind the veil. Chapter 13. Mary, Queen of Scots, a crown in exile. In the soft light of a December morning in 1542, a queen was born into silence. Mary Stuart entered the world just days before her father, King James V of Scotland, passed away. He never saw her grow. He never heard her speak. Yet she became queen before she was even a week old, crowned not with strength, but with sorrow. From her first breath she was royalty. But she would never rule in peace. Scotland in the 16th century was a kingdom of hills and rival clans, torn between English ambitions and French alliances. To protect her future, her guardians looked across the sea, toward France, where Catholic kings ruled and Catholic faith was firm. At just 5 years old, Mary was sent away from the rugged highlands of her homeland to the glittering palaces of Paris. France was light and silk, music and manners. It was a world shaped for queens, and Mary learned to walk through it with elegance. She was raised alongside the French royal family, treated not as a foreigner, but as a jewel of the court. She spoke French like a native, danced with grace, wrote poetry. She was not just a monarch in name. She was a queen in spirit. In 1558, at 16, Mary married the Dauphin of France, young Francis, heir to the French throne. The union was delicate, youthful, full of hope. When Francis became king the next year, Mary was crowned Queen of France. For a moment, she held 2 crowns, Scotland and France, balanced gently on her brow. But the moment was brief. Francis died just a year later, and with him the crown of France slipped from her head. At 18, Mary returned to Scotland, a widow, a foreign queen in her native land. The court she came home to was colder than she remembered. The land darker, the throne uneasy beneath her. The promise of her birth still lingered, but the shadows had already begun to gather. The marriage game. Mary's return to Scotland marked the beginning of a dangerous game, one played with hearts, titles and swords. She needed to marry again. As queen, her womb was a throne room, her alliances a matter of war and peace, but every option carried risk. Some were English, favoured by Elizabeth I of England, who watched her closely. Others were Catholic nobles, tied to foreign interests. In the end, Mary chose Lord Darnley, handsome, charming, and with a royal bloodline that strengthened her own claim to the English throne. But charm does not make a king, Darnley soon revealed, himself to be unstable, jealous, and reckless. He resented Mary's power, he thirsted for control. In 1566, in an act of brutal betrayal, Darnley and his allies murdered Mary's secretary right before her eyes while she was pregnant with their child. The violence shook the court, it shook Mary, and it marked the beginning of her unravelling. Months later, Darnley himself was dead, killed in an explosion, though his strangled body was found outside the blast. Suspicion fell everywhere. Many believed Mary had known. Some believed she had ordered it. And then came Bothwell. James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, was bold, ruthless, and commanding. He had been one of Mary's few defenders. Now he became something more. Days after Darnley's death, Mary was abducted, or perhaps persuaded, and soon married Bothwell in haste. Whether by force or design, the act shattered her image. Nobles rose against her. The people turned cold. Mary, once a golden queen, was now seen as a scandal, a threat, a storm. In 1567 she was imprisoned and forced to abdicate. Her infant son James was crowned king. Mary, queen by birth, bride by politics, and widow by fate, had fallen. But she would not stay silent. Flight and prison. Escaping from the castle that held her, Mary gathered an army of loyalists. There was still strength in her name. Still, fire in her heart. But the battle she waged ended in defeat. Her forces were crushed. Her choices narrowed. In desperation, she fled across the border into England, seeking safety from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth. But queens do not shelter queens. Elizabeth saw not a refugee, but a rival. Mary had long claimed a right to the English throne, being a Catholic descendant of Henry VII. To Elizabeth, whose own claim was always questioned, Mary was a danger that could not be ignored, so she was imprisoned, not in a dungeon, but in a long procession of manor houses and stone halls, always watched, always guarded. For 19 years, Mary lived behind walls, a queen in name only. Still she wrote letters that travelled across borders. Pleas for freedom, prayers, poems, and perhaps plans. Plots to free her. Plots to replace Elizabeth. Whether she encouraged them or merely knew of them remains debated. But one thing was certain. Her existence was now seen as a threat to the peace of England. She was a queen without a throne, a prisoner with a crown made of memory. Her world was narrowed to corridors, gardens, and ink. Yet her name still stirred hearts, still lit fires, still echoed through the halls of power. And Elizabeth, ever cautious, ever alert, began to feel the weight of Mary's shadow. A queen without a throne. In 1586 a plot was uncovered. It was called the Babington Plot, a scheme to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne of England. Letters were intercepted. Mary's handwriting was found. Her signature, too. Whether she was truly behind it or merely caught in, the current of conspiracy did not matter now. The verdict was set. Treason. And for a queen, there could be only one sentence. On a grey February morning in 1587, Mary was led to the execution block at Fotheringhay Castle. She wore red, ichafis, colour of Catholic martyrdom. Her final letters, written the night before, were sent to the Pope, to France, to her son. Words of forgiveness, of courage, of faith. She died with grace, with dignity, with the quiet resolve of someone who had worn every mask life could offer. Bride, mother, queen, prisoner. Her death did not end the story. It began a legend. To Catholics, she became a martyr, a symbol of suffering and sacrifice. To Protestants, a warning of danger hidden behind beauty. To poets and painters, she was tragedy made flesh. A woman born to rule, undone by love, by politics, by fate. Elizabeth, who had signed the warrant, grieved deeply. She had executed not just a queen, but a cousin, a mirror, a shadow of herself. She ruled for 16 more years, but Mary was never far from her mind. Years later, it would be Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, who inherited Elizabeth's throne. A peaceful succession, a silent merging of crowns. In the end, Mary's blood did rule England, though not through rebellion, but through time. She remains one of history's most haunting figures, a queen too bright for the age she lived in. A life not written in victory, but in longing, a crown in exile. Chapter 14. Elizabeth Burrus, the Virgin Queen and the Golden Age. She was born in September of 1533, beneath the vaulted ceilings of Greenwich Palace, to the great expectations of a divided court. Her mother was Anne Boleyn, clever, elegant, and controversial. Her father was Henry VIII, a king desperate for a son. But Elizabeth was not a son, she was a girl, and with that the fragile hopes that surrounded her birth began to fray. Within 3 years her mother was dead, executed by the same king who had once torn an empire apart to marry her. Anne Boleyn's fall was swift and brutal. Elizabeth, still a toddler, was declared illegitimate. Her title as princess was stripped away. Her place in the royal line became uncertain. She remained at court, but always on the edge, watched, whispered about, and quietly set aside. She grew up between palaces and politics, not royal enough to command attention, not powerless enough to be ignored. Her half-sister Mary, the daughter of Henry's first queen, ruled with strict Catholic devotion. Elizabeth, a Protestant by upbringing and temperament, was viewed with suspicion. During Mary's reign, Elizabeth was arrested and locked in the Tower of London, accused of treasonous sympathy with rebels. She survived, barely, but the lesson was clear. To be Elizabeth was to walk a narrow road, and yet, even in silence, she learned. She read Latin and Greek, studied history and scripture, learned how to listen without answering, how to hide fear behind calm, how to wait. When Mary died in 1558, the crown passed to Elizabeth, the forgotten daughter of a disgraced queen. The court held its breath. No one knew what she would become, but Elizabeth knew. She had watched the storm her entire life. Now she would be the eye within it, crowned alone. Elizabeth's coronation took place in January of 1559. She entered Westminster Abbey not just as a new monarch, but as a mystery. A young woman with sharp eyes and a mind trained in silence. She was 25 years old, and she would never marry. From the very beginning, questions circled around her like bees. Who would she wed? A French prince? A Spanish heir? An English noble? But Elizabeth answered with stillness, with delay, with a knowing smile. Her refusal to marry became more than personal. It became political, a strategy, a message. She called herself the Virgin Queen, not as a rejection of love, but as a declaration of sovereignty. If she married, power would shift. If she ruled alone, the crown remained hers entirely. In a world where queens were expected to become wives, Elizabeth chose instead to become a symbol, and she cultivated that image with extraordinary care. Portraits showed her draped in pearls and velvet, untouched by time. Her speeches, delivered with grace and wit, struck chords of loyalty and awe. She was often distant, often private, but she knew the stage. She made power look effortless, even when it came at great cost. The court around her became a dance of loyalty and ambition. Men loved her, but none could claim her. Nobles served her, but never truly knew her. She was, in many ways, alone, and yet never without presence. To rule as a woman was to rule under scrutiny. To rule as an unmarried woman was to turn that scrutiny into strength, and so she did. The Armada and the Rose, Elizabeth's England faced threats on all sides. Catholic Europe viewed her as a heretic queen. Inside her borders, rebellion simmered in whispers. Outside, Spain, the most powerful empire in the world, waited for the right moment to strike. That moment came in 1588, when King Philip II of Spain sent the Armada, a massive fleet of warships, to invade England and remove her from the throne. But Elizabeth did not flinch. She rode out to address her troops at Tilbury, dressed in armour, speaking with fire and resolve. She told them, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." The line would echo through history, not just for its boldness, but for its truth. The Armada failed. English ships, smaller, faster, harassed the fleet. Storms scattered the Spaniards. The invasion collapsed. England stood firm, and Elizabeth emerged stronger than ever. Yet her strength was not only in war, she ruled through patience, through subtlety, through what her counsellors called the art of delay. She avoided hasty decisions, played suitors and ambassadors like pieces on a board. She made policy through waiting, watching which way the wind turned before setting sail. This was the golden age of Shakespeare and Marlowe, of new words and new worlds. Explorers set out across oceans. Poets set quills to parchment. Music filled courtly halls. The theatre of England, both literal and political, reached its peak. Elizabeth stood at the centre of it all, calm and composed, a rose without thorns, and yet impossible to grasp. Gloriana, as the years passed, Elizabeth grew older, but never faded. She reigned for 45 years. Through plague, through rebellion, through scandal and success. She saw beloved advisers die, watched rivals rise and fall, and walked the long road of power in a world not built for queens. She never named a successor, never married, never gave her people the comfort of certainty, and still they loved her. To many, she became more than human. She became Gloriana, the fairy queen of myth and verse. Painters stopped trying to show her age. Instead, they painted symbols: suns, moons, orbs, and sceptres. Elizabeth was no longer just a monarch. She was England itself, eternal, radiant, untouched. But in private, she knew the weight she carried, the loneliness, the long hours of silence in empty chambers, the faces she had loved, now only memories. Her final years were spent in quiet sorrow. The golden mask never cracked, but behind it, the woman grew weary. In March of 1603, Elizabeth, "I passed away at Richmond Palace. She left no children, no heirs of her own body, yet she left a nation transformed, steady, proud, ready to face the modern world." With her death, the Tudor dynasty ended, but her legacy endured. She had taken the throne as a child of scandal. She left it as a legend. Elizabeth, the queen who ruled alone, yet never without grace. The ruler who turned solitude into strength. The monarch who lit the stage for a golden age, and in doing so became the light herself. Chapter 15. Christina of Sweden, the queen who refused the crown. In the stillness of a Swedish winter, in December of 1626, a child was born beneath the frozen skies. A daughter named Christina. But the announcement was filled with confusion. The midwives had first declared her a boy. The court rejoiced, for a male heir had arrived. Then the truth unfolded. It was a girl. And the rejoicing turned quiet. Christina was the only surviving legitimate child of King Gustavus Adolphus and Queen Maria Eleonora. Her father, Sweden's lion-hearted king, had hoped for a son to carry his legacy. But Christina, even in infancy, seemed to carry something different, a will, a presence, a strength beyond expectation. Her father embraced her birth. He declared that she would be raised to rule, regardless of gender. From that moment, she was treated as a prince. She wore breeches instead of gowns, rode horses through the courtyards, studied history, philosophy, and statecraft with intensity. She was spoken to like a future monarch, not a noble daughter. And she listened with the mind of someone who always knew she did not fit the mould. When Gustavus died in battle just 6 years later, Sweden became a kingdom without a king. Christina was declared his successor, a child heir with the weight of a Protestant empire on her small shoulders. A regency was formed, but even as a girl, Christina's voice began to rise. She asked questions no one expected. She argued with scholars. She learned Latin, Greek, and politics with the sharpness of someone always searching for more. She was not docile, not silent, not easily shaped. Her hair was often uncombed, her manners blunt. She mocked fashion, she scorned vanity, she moved like a flame, unpredictable, untamed, and brilliant. In a court that expected queens to smile and sit quietly, Christina was already rewriting the script. The scholar queen, when she took full control of the throne in 1644 at just 18 years old, Christina became something rare, a monarch who loved ideas more than conquest. Her court in Stockholm became a sanctuary for thinkers, artists, and philosophers. She transformed the Swedish palace into one of Europe's great intellectual centres, a place of conversation, debate, and creation. She read constantly, devouring works on theology, politics, astronomy, and metaphysics. Books were her greatest companions, truth, her greatest hunger. Christina believed that knowledge should rule over ignorance, and that power without learning was hollow. She surrounded herself with minds that challenged her, poets who stirred her imagination, scientists who mapped the heavens, and philosophers who questioned the soul. One name stood above them all, René Descartes. She admired him from afar, fascinated by his method, his logic, and his bold declarations of reason. In 1649 she summoned him to Sweden. It was winter, the kind of Swedish cold that cracked windows and froze water in its cup. Descartes, used to the mild air of France, struggled in the chill. Yet he came, drawn by Christina's mind. They met in early mornings long before dawn. Discussions of existence, of the nature of being, of the human soul. Descartes taught her, and Christina, true to form, debated him, but within months he grew ill. The cold worsened. In early 1650 Descartes died in Stockholm. Some blamed the weather, others whispered of exhaustion, as though even a mind like his could not keep pace with Christina's curiosity. Still the flame he lit in her did not dim. She continued to chase meaning beyond the boundaries of power. Ruling a kingdom began to feel like a cage. The ceremonies, the judgments, the expectations, they pressed against her. She longed not for battlefields or borders, but for something unspoken, something eternal. And so Christina began to prepare for a decision no one expected. The crown set down. In 1654, after just 10 years of rule, Queen Christina stood before the Swedish Parliament and gave up her throne. She had no children, no consort, No plan that anyone could understand. The court watched in silence as she removed the crown from her head and placed it into the hands of her cousin, Charles Gustave. She stepped away from the throne with a quiet, final grace. Not forced, not overthrown, but by her own choice. It was unthinkable. Queens did not abdicate. Power was not something one simply walked away from, but Christina was never shaped by rules. She had always been different, and now she made that difference permanent. With her departure, she left behind not just royal duties, but the weight of identity itself. She packed her books, her memories, and her vision, and disappeared into the roads of Europe. Not as a queen, but as a seeker. Her journey led her to Rome, and with it came another shock. She converted to Catholicism. Sweden was fiercely Protestant. Her father had died defending the Protestant cause in the 30 Years' War. Her court had been built on Lutheran tradition, and yet in secret Christina had been questioning, reading Catholic writings, meeting Jesuit priests, pondering theology not as a ruler but as a soul. When she arrived in Italy in 1655, she was received with awe. Rome welcomed her like a returning empress. Processions lined the streets. Artists painted her in triumph. But beneath the celebration was something quieter, a woman who had chosen ideas over inheritance, thought over title, spirit over crown. She had laid down the sword and picked up the quill. The pilgrim and the papal court, Christina spent the rest of her life in Rome, not as a queen in exile, but as a pilgrim of the mind. She kept a home filled with art and music. Cardinals, poets, philosophers, and scientists came to dine at her table. Her rooms were filled with laughter and debate, with stories and theories, with long nights of wine and wondering. She was a Catholic, yes, but she remained uniquely herself. She questioned tradition, defended Jews from persecution, supported the arts with passion. She was a patron of opera, a friend of Bernini, a royal who preferred conversation over ceremony. The papal court was both fascinated and unsettled by her. She did not behave like other women of rank. She wore men's clothes when it pleased her. She rejected marriage. She lived alone. Even in Rome she defied categories, neither saint nor sinner, neither ruler nor recluse. Her beliefs were sincere but never blind, her thoughts sharp but never cruel. She had walked away from crowns and palaces, but never from her mission, to live fully, to think freely, to be wholly herself. Christina died in 1689 at the age of 62. She was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, an honour almost never given to women. Yet even in death she remained a paradox. A Protestant queen buried in Catholic stone, a monarch without a kingdom, a woman who ruled by thought, not by force. Today, Christina of Sweden is remembered not for what she conquered, but for what she let go. She remains a symbol of freedom, not the freedom to rule, but the freedom to choose, the queen who stepped down, the seeker who rose, a sovereign of the soul. Chapter 16. Maria Theresa of Austria, the Iron Mother of Empires. She was born into splendor, the daughter of an emperor, raised among marble halls and gilded tapestries. But when Maria Theresa first opened her eyes in 1717, no one believed she would one day rule. The Holy Roman Empire was a man's world, forged in war, bound by treaties, and tangled in centuries of tradition. Women, though noble and royal, were not expected to wear the crown. Her father, Charles VI, had no sons, and so long before his death he issued what came to be known as the Pragmatic Sanction, a decree that, against precedent, allowed his daughter to inherit his lands. He worked tirelessly to convince Europe's monarchs to accept it, to see her as rightful heir. On paper, the promise was made, but paper in politics burns easily. When Charles II died in 1740, Maria Theresa inherited the Habsburg dominions, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and more. She was only 23. She had no formal military training, no experience in diplomacy. She was a young mother pregnant with her 5th child, and suddenly she was empress, but not everyone accepted her. The War of the Austrian Succession began almost at once. Prussia invaded Silesia. Other powers, Spain, Bavaria, France, circled like wolves. They saw a young woman on the throne and imagined weakness, but Maria Theresa was not weak. She rallied her people, rode on horseback to the Hungarian Diet, where, in full regalia and with fire in her voice, she asked for support. The nobles, moved by her courage, offered their loyalty and their swords. What followed was nearly a decade of conflict. Maria Theresa faced defeat, setbacks, and betrayal, yet she held her ground. She lost Silesia, but kept the heart of her empire. She did not crumble, she adapted, she learned. From the ashes of a threatened inheritance, Maria Theresa began building something far greater, an empire not of fear, but of endurance. Mother and monarch. Maria Theresa did not just rule an empire. She gave birth to one, literally and figuratively. She had 16 children, 11 daughters and 5 sons. Each one carefully raised, married, and, when possible, placed upon European thrones. Her family became her foreign policy. Her daughters became queens. Her sons, kings. Most famously, her daughter Maria Antonia, later known as Marie Antoinette, would become Queen of France. Motherhood was not separate from her rule. It was part of her identity, her strategy, and her strength. She nursed her children, wrote letters to them daily, disciplined them, and arranged their futures with calculated precision. Her palace bustled not just with ministers, but with children's footsteps, tutors, and lullabies, and yet she ruled without distraction. Maria Theresa read reports by candlelight, held court with unflinching presence. She rose early, worked long, and often skipped ceremony for substance. Her husband, Francis I, was named Holy Roman Emperor, a title that sounded grand, but in truth he deferred to her judgment in most affairs. She loved him deeply, but she led alone. Her personal and political lives ran on parallel tracks, often colliding, always intertwined. At her dining table, she spoke with foreign dignitaries. In her study, she mourned when her children were sick or far away. She wrote letters not only to generals, but to her daughters in far-off lands, reminding them of their duties, their posture, and their prayers. Maria Theresa embodied the duality of being both monarch and mother. Fierce in both roles, tender when she could be, firm when she must be, and always deeply human beneath the crown. The architect of reform, Maria Theresa's reign was not just about survival, it was about transformation. She inherited an empire held together by tradition, often tangled in inefficiency and privilege. But instead of merely protecting the old order, she reimagined it. She restructured the military, ensuring a more professional and better funded army, not one dependent on scattered loyalties, but on discipline and unity. She overhauled the tax system, insisting that even the nobles contribute their share. It was unpopular, but she stood firm. An empire needed fairness, not just ceremony. In education, she planted deep roots. She made schooling mandatory for both boys and girls, a radical idea in an age where learning was still a luxury. She wanted a literate population, not for rebellion, but for reason. She believed that an informed people would be more loyal, more prosperous, and more capable of carrying the empire forward. Her reforms reached into law and commerce. She revised the legal code, streamlined bureaucracy, and introduced standards that would echo into modern Austria and beyond. She was not revolutionary. She remained deeply Catholic, conservative in some values, but she was tireless in her mission to modernize, and through it all, she faced criticism from foreign courts, from within her own ranks, but she rarely responded with anger. Instead, she worked harder, listened, adapted, and pushed again. Maria Theresa did not seek glory in battle. She found it in policy, in structure, in legacy. She believed that empires should not just expand, they should evolve. And so hers did. Faith, grief, and the crown. In 1765, after 25 years of marriage, Maria Theresa's husband, Francis III, died suddenly while attending a play. His passing shattered her. Though she had always ruled with more authority, she loved him deeply. He had been her partner, her comfort, her closest confidant. After his death, something in her changed. She dressed in black and would wear mourning clothes for the rest of her life. Nearly 15 years. The colour became part of her presence, a shadow stitched into the very fabric of her rule. She withdrew from court celebrations, spoke more softly. Her public appearances became rarer, her letters more emotional, yet she did not abdicate. She did not falter. Her grief became a second skin, one she carried with both pride and sorrow. In her later years, she ruled alongside her son, Joseph II. They often disagreed. He was more progressive, more restless, more impatient with tradition, but she allowed him room. Even in disagreement, she guided, reminded, taught. She remained the steady hand, quieter now, but just as deliberate. She found strength in her faith. Daily prayers, spiritual counsel, and rituals gave her rhythm and clarity. Her Catholicism was deep, sometimes strict, but always sincere. It was not only a public posture, but a private lifeline. As her health declined, she faced it as she had faced all things, with composure. In 1780, Maria Theresa passed away at the age of 63. She left behind a transformed empire, a family that had shaped Europe's thrones, and a reputation carved not by conquest, but by endurance, intelligence, and maternal strength. She was not a warrior queen. She was something rarer, a builder of nations, a weaver of dynasties, and a sovereign who turned trials into transformation. In the heart of Vienna, where her influence still lingers in stone and law, she is remembered not only as empress, but as the Iron Mother who shaped an empire with love, wisdom, and unwavering will. Chapter 17. Catherine the Great, the empress who took the empire. She was born as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess, bright-eyed and bookish, with no claim to thrones or crowns. The year was 1729. Her childhood was spent in a quiet corner of Prussia, where winters came early and dreams were often modest. But Sophie's dreams were different. She was curious, quick, and drawn to stories of rulers, philosophers, and empires. At 14, her life changed. An invitation came from the Russian court. Empress Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great, was seeking a bride for her nephew and heir, the Grand Duke Peter. Sophie was chosen, not for her title, which was small, but for her bloodline, for her composure, and for what the Empress believed she could be shaped into. Sophie left Germany for Russia, a land vast, foreign, cold in ways that had nothing to do with weather. The Russian court was ornate and unpredictable. Traditions wrapped in splendor, etiquette sharpened like knives. Sophie, still a girl, entered this world like a shadow at the edge of a painting. To survive, she transformed. She converted to the Russian Orthodox faith, changing her name to Ekaterina, Catherine. She learned the language. She studied Russian, history. She practiced until she spoke like a native, and all the while she watched. She learned the patterns of power, the silences, the flattery, the danger of missteps. Her husband-to-be, Peter, was awkward and cruel. He played with soldiers like toys, admired Prussia more than Russia, and showed little interest in his bride. Catherine quickly realized that no one would protect her, not the court, not her husband, not even fate. So she decided to protect herself. Behind her soft gaze was strategy. Behind her quiet voice, ambition. She had not come for decoration. She had come to rule. And slowly, carefully, she began laying the pieces for something no one expected. Crowned by coup in 1762, the Russian throne was trembling. Peter III had finally inherited the crown, but his rule, like his mind, was unstable. He alienated the army, insulted the church, and admired Russia's enemies. He undid reforms, dismissed allies, and laughed at tradition. Within months, the court whispered rebellion. Catherine listened. She had spent years gathering allies, noble families, army officers, loyal confidants. She knew who to trust, who to flatter, and who to fear. And when the moment came, she moved. In July of that same year, while Peter was away at his palace, Catherine made her move. She dressed in military uniform, rode to the barracks, and addressed the soldiers as their rightful sovereign. The church blessed her. The army cheered. The coup was swift, almost bloodless. Peter was arrested. Days later, he was dead. Officially, it was natural causes. But history rarely accepts simple answers. Catherine was now Empress of Russia, not by inheritance, not by marriage, but by force. She had seized a crown that was never meant for her, and she wore it without apology. The court held its breath. Would she last? Could a foreign-born woman, now a widow and usurper, rule the largest empire on earth? Catherine answered not with hesitation but with command. She took the throne, sat tall, and began the reign that would define Russia for a century. Enlightenment and iron, Catherine styled herself as an enlightened monarch, a ruler who read. Voltaire, who wrote letters to philosophers, who believed in reason and reform. She opened schools, modernized laws, invited intellectuals to her court. She corresponded with the greatest minds of her time, dreaming of a society shaped by wisdom and justice. She even tried to draft a new legal code, one that treated all Russians as equals under the law. She hosted salons, discussed science and music, and gathered artists from across Europe. Her court, once cold and severe, became one of the most glittering in the world. But beneath the shimmer there was steel. Catherine may have admired the Enlightenment, but she ruled with caution and force. When rebellion rose in the countryside, she crushed it. The Pugachev rebellion, a massive uprising of peasants, was answered with brutal punishment. She strengthened the nobility's power over serfs, not weakened it. And while she dreamed of liberty in letters, she feared revolution in practice. In her eyes, Russia was not yet ready for freedom. She knew what happened to monarchs who gave too much. She had watched France with growing alarm as ideas turned into guillotines. And so she remained a paradox, a woman who quoted Voltaire but censored dissent, who praised learning but feared change. She walked a tightrope between progress and control, writing poems in the morning, issuing arrests by nightfall. Catherine ruled with brilliance, but always with iron beneath her ink, empire. Without apology. Under Catherine's rule, Russia grew larger, stronger, and more feared than ever before. She expanded the empire's borders through war and diplomacy. She fought the Ottoman Turks and won access to the Black Sea. She annexed Crimea. She reached into Poland, carving pieces for Russia through partition and pressure. By the end of her reign, Russia was one of the great powers of Europe, not only in land but in voice. Her court was famous not only for politics but for passion. Catherine was a woman of intellect, but also of desire. She had many lovers, some fleeting, some lasting, all chosen on her terms. They were often younger, ambitious, carefully selected. Some became advisors, others only memories. She made no excuses. She broke every mold, and in doing so, she built her own mythology. Enemies whispered scandals, poets wrote fables, historians, often men, painted her with shadows and flames. But Catherine, always composed, simply continued to rule. She wrote memoirs in her final years, reflective, sharp, and unashamed. She described her youth, her rise, her thoughts on power and philosophy. She told her story before others could rewrite it. She died in 1796 at the age of 67. Her son Paul inherited the throne, but her legacy endured far beyond his reign. Catherine the Great, empress, usurper, philosopher, conqueror, remains one of the most fascinating figures in history. She did not inherit her empire. She took it. She did not rule like others. She ruled as herself. And in doing so, she reshaped Russia, not only on the map, but in the mind of the world. Chapter 18. Queen Victoria, the widow who ruled the world. In the soft morning light of Kensington Palace, a small girl grew up with no thought of a throne. Her name was Alexandrina Victoria, a child of comfort, not power. She was fifth, in line to the crown when she was born in 1819, a sheltered daughter of the Duke and Duchess of Kent, cocooned from courtly ambition and political weight, but fate has a quiet way of climbing ladders. Death reshuffled the royal line. Uncles passed, heirs vanished, and one by one the branches above her fell. By the time she was 11, she was next in line. By 18, she was queen. On a June morning in 1837, still barely grown, Victoria received the news. Her uncle, King William III, was dead. And now, she, the quiet girl with the high voice and firm handwriting, was sovereign of the world's largest empire. She had been kept apart from the court her whole life, raised under the strict Kensington system, a set of rules, designed to keep her dependent, obedient. But on the day she became queen, something shifted. Her first act of independence was simple. She asked to be alone. For the first time, truly alone, and from that moment, she never looked back. Her coronation was a spectacle of gold and procession, yet behind the velvet was a young woman trying to balance fear and resolve. The weight of the crown was not just ceremonial. It was political, global, spiritual. At just 18, she inherited not only a monarchy, but an empire. And though many doubted her, she did not falter. Victoria became queen with quiet grace, but she stayed queen through steel, Albert, and empire. 2 years into her reign, Victoria met the man who would change her life, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg, and Gotha, her cousin from Germany. Their connection was immediate. She proposed to him, not the other way around, a royal gesture that set the tone for a lifetime of partnership. Albert was reserved, intellectual, and disciplined. Where Victoria was emotional and instinctive, he was precise and thoughtful. Their marriage became not just a love story, but a co-rulership. He helped shape her reign, advising her on state matters, architecture, science, and international diplomacy. Together they became the image of a new monarchy, family-centered, moral stable. They had 9 children, each destined to marry into the courts of Europe. Victoria would one day be called the grandmother of Europe for the network of royal bloodlines she helped spin. Albert introduced reforms. He championed the arts, education, and industrial progress. The Great Exhibition of 1851, a marvel of glass and iron, was his vision, a showcase of Britain's power and progress under one vast, glittering roof. Victoria, by his side, was proud, moved, and radiant. But the joy would not last. In 1861, Albert died suddenly of illness. Victoria was shattered. Her world stopped. Her grief was so deep, so consuming, that she vanished from public life. She wore black for the rest of her days, 40 years of mourning stitched into every dress, every appearance. Albert's presence never left her. His portraits remained on her walls. His memory lingered in every room. She wrote to him in journals, spoke of him as though he were still beside her. She ruled in his shadow, not diminished, but changed. Through mourning, she became myth. The sun never sets. As Victoria aged, her empire stretched wider. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," became more than poetry. It became geography. From India to Africa, from the Caribbean to the Pacific, Britain's reach was vast and growing. Victoria, though far from battlefields, became the face of it all. In 1876 she was declared Empress of India, a title she accepted with solemn pride. Her name was whispered in desert winds and shouted in colonial parades. But empire was not only glory, it was conquest, it was control. Colonialism brought railroads and schools, but also bloodshed and domination. Indigenous cultures were reshaped or erased. Rebellions rose. Some were crushed swiftly, Others lingered in memory. Victoria did not govern colonies directly, but her image was everywhere, on coins, in portraits, in the minds of those who served the crown. She became the symbol of the era's contradictions, grandeur and grief, progress and pain, civilization and conquest. Meanwhile, the world transformed around her. The Industrial Revolution turned cities into machines, trains roared across landscapes, telegraphs shrunk distances, the camera captured moments, science challenged faith, poverty pressed against palaces, and still Victoria reigned. She met with prime ministers. She navigated wars in Crimea, in South Africa, in Afghanistan. Her opinions shaped governments, her silences too. Through eras of upheaval she remained a steady presence in a spinning world. A queen in shadow. Victoria's later years were marked by solemnity and reflection. She had become not just a monarch, but a monument, a living relic of a century that was changing faster than anyone could understand. The young queen who once danced at balls now walked slowly with a cane, veiled in black, her features lined by time. Yet her influence never faded. She presided over jubilees that drew millions to the streets. Her Golden Jubilee in 1887, her Diamond Jubilee in 1897. The celebrations were not just for her, but for what she represented: continuity, stability, memory. She wrote constantly, diaries, letters, reflections. She kept a tradition, but not without insight. She formed close bonds with servants, especially John Brown and later Abdul Karim, drawing curiosity and scandal from a court unsure of how to understand affection outside aristocracy. In her private world, Victoria was both deeply conservative and strangely modern, bound by duty but always reaching for connection. She died on January 22, 1901, at the age of 81, with her family around her. She had reigned for 63 years, longer than any monarch before her. With her death, the Victorian era ended, an age of steam and sorrow, of velvet and empire, of invention and grief. She left behind a world she had helped shape, not through battle or bravado, but through presence, through resilience, through the quiet, lasting power of endurance. Queen Victoria, the widow who ruled the world, became more than a name. She became time itself.